Welcome, everyone. My name is Lynette Roth, and I'm the Daimler Curator of the Busch-Reisinger Museum and head of the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Harvard Art Museums. And I'm going to be serving as a moderator for our Q&A later on. I want to thank you first for joining us for this session of our new series called Art Talks Live, which offer an up-close look at works from our collections with our team of curators, conservators, curatorial fellows, and graduate students. And you can join us every other Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. here on Zoom for these short interactive talks, which along with our ongoing Art Talks video series, investigate artist materials and techniques, reveal our latest discoveries, and offer a fresh look at old favorites in the collections of the Harvard Art Museums. So I'm just going to go over a few logistics for you. You'll notice that we're using our webinar format in Zoom, so your microphones are muted and your videos are not visible. Instead, please submit brief questions if you like via the Q&A box, which you should be able to access at the bottom of your screen. The presentation today will last approximately 15 minutes, and we're going to dedicate the last 15 minutes to the question and answer period. And while I'll do my best to get to every question, we do have a large group today, so I may not be able to address them all. I would encourage you, if you like, to go ahead during the presentation and already put your questions in the Q&A box, but we're not going to get to them until the end of the talk. And we will plan to conclude the talk at 2:30. So now I am very pleased to introduce our speaker today, Frances Gallart Marqués, the Frederick, Randolph, Grace Curatorial Fellow in Ancient Art. And during her tenure at the Harvard Art Museums, which sadly will end at the end of this summer, Frances has researched and cataloged the collection of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern art, and also assisted with the fabulous 2018 exhibition, Animal-Shaped Vessels from the Ancient World, which I hope you did have a chance to see. Her research interests include terracotta figurines, domestic spaces in late antiquity, and social justice art education. Today, Frances will be sharing with us her talk, Mirror, Mirror, Reflections on the Etruscans and Their Afterlife. So with that, I turn it over to Frances.
Thank you, Lynette. And thank you all for joining me today. I live alone, so I appreciate your company, even if I can't see or hear you. I see you in my heart. And I am very happy that I get to share with you a bit of the ancient world, which I love because it was strange and colorful and very much unlike our own. And I want to let you know a bit of where I'm coming from. Although I am currently working at the Harvard Art Museums as a curatorial fellow, I am an archaeologist, so most of my training has happened in the field, specifically at a site in Western Anatolia called Sardis. And I say this because when I think about art, I think about objects with full multi-dimensional lives and that are more than the things that they may have represented on their surfaces. Now, if you were at the museums with me, I would coax you into climbing the stairs up to the third floor, and we would have to catch our breath at the landing, and then make our way into our bright Roman gallery. And I would then, perhaps to your great annoyance, skip over the gleaming marble statuary, so hi Trajan, and I would walk you over to the very back, to the one lonely recessed case in the entire gallery. And this is probably my favorite space in the museum because it's full of tiny objects with large personalities and fantastic stories. They can take a bit more work to appreciate, but objects that are small and fragmented are worth knowing. And I firmly believe that their close observation and our interaction with them can lead us to feel empathy with humans beyond our own moment or space, even if we cannot know them fully. And that is actually my hope for today. And although I love them all, especially like this little guy over here, I have chosen to discuss a larger object hanging above, a bronze mirror made by the Etruscans sometime in the 3rd century BC. Before I talk about the mirror, however, I do want to say a few words about the Etruscans and why it is that we have included their art in our so-called Roman art gallery. And well, first of all, our display space is lovely, but it's not infinite. So we can't dedicate an entire gallery to the Etruscans as much as we would like to. And second, before Rome was Rome, it was the Etruscans who controlled most of the peninsula that we now call Italy. The most important cities in modern Tuscany, which comes from Etruscan, so Florence, Pisa, and Siena, to name a few, were first established by them, and as you know, are still inhabited. And Etruscan influence on ancient Rome was profound, since it was from them that the Romans inherited some of their most distinctive cultural and artistic traditions, like temple design, gladiatorial combat, and divination, amongst others. And yet we tend to speak less of the Etruscans because none of their own histories or literature survive. We know them mostly thanks to the objects that they left behind. And these objects in turn come mostly from burials. Luckily for us, the Etruscans took great care of their dead and furnished their tombs to function as comfortable homes. Now, many Etruscan burials were simple, but once the Etruscans began to trade their natural resources with other Mediterranean cultures, they became remarkably wealthy, their tombs more magnificent, and their grave goods more plentiful. Using the evidence gathered from extensive cemeteries such as this one and what was ancient Caere, we have begun to look at the world of the dead and then extrapolate what we can into the world of the living. Of course, there is a real danger there of getting things wrong, but we aim to be as careful as we can and are always open to reevaluation and continued study. Very well, back to our mirror. We have 10 Etruscan bronze mirrors at the Harvard Art Museums, of which I will show you 4. All of our mirrors have engraved designs, some of which are quite elaborate and have been difficult to decipher. Although they existed, very early mirrors, or very few of early mirrors survived. We do know that they transformed, evolving from thick, flat pieces of metal to thinner objects with convex reflective surfaces and concave reverses. The mirrors in our collection range in date, from the early 5th century to the mid-2nd century BC. Throughout which 3 types were produced. First, box mirrors, and this one's actually not Etruscan but Greek, which consisted of 2 discs that stacked together and were joined by a hinge. So kind of like a modern compact. Tang mirrors, which had an attached handle made of a different material, so usually wood, bone, or ivory, and then handled mirrors that were cast in one piece. And I will show you examples of these last 2. We have to imagine that these generally small objects played an integral part within Etruscan daily life, as we know over 3,000 mirrors, making them the largest body of surviving artwork in Etruria. There is even an international project dedicated to publishing all of them, the Corpus Speculorum Etruscorum, which is one of those examples of deploying Latin to its greatest rhyming potential, and it has multiple volumes. Now again, remember that the great majority of the objects that survive were recovered from tombs, and keep in mind that tombs were discovered, especially those that were discovered early on, were not excavated as systematically as we would today. So many mirrors have lost their exact context. And because of this lack of information on the one hand, and our own prejudices on the other, mirrors tend to be disproportionately associated with women and with their practices of beautification and adornment. They then tend to be dismissed as one of many accessories necessary to perform a proper toilette, and thus as a symbol of proper femininity, wealth, and social standing. And that's not entirely unwarranted. One of the few images that we have of an Etruscan handling a mirror is this wonderful painted terracotta sarcophagus excavated near Cusi and now in the British Museum. It contained the skeleton of a middle-aged woman and preserved part of her name, Shayanti Hanunia, wife of Tlesna. She probably belonged to one of the richest families in Cusi, as she is ornately dressed and wears a tiara, earrings, bracelet, and a necklace. She leans against a pillow and holds a mirror in her other hand, so this is probably a box mirror, and then gazes off into the distance. However, mirrors have been found in both modest and aristocratic contexts and in association with both men and women. All adults, though, no children as far as I know. Furthermore, because a significant number of women's tombs contain no mirrors, but instead other goods associated with personal hygiene and beautification, I don't think that we can say that mirrors had an exclusive role to play in terms of adornment, either in life or in the afterlife. One curious thing that we have found in the tombs that have been excavated carefully is that when mirrors do appear next to people, they're always placed with their reflective sides visible, so with the reflective side up. And if that doesn't suggest some sort of ritual function, at least in the funerary environment, I don't know what does. And I think that most of us can agree that there is something special about mirrors. Of all the things that we can use in our grooming routines, say a hairbrush or pins or makeup or perfume, it is the mirror that we associate with superstition. You might have grown up believing that if you break a mirror, you will end up with many years of bad luck, or that if you stand in front of one and repeat a magical phrase several times, you might call upon yourself some unspeakable horror, or you might have felt that odd fear, one that I think many of us share, that sometimes, especially in the dark, mirrors might not reflect exactly what is there. And Argentinian author Jorge Luis Borges was famously terrified of mirrors and wrote much about them, including this famous line in one of his stories: mirrors and copulation are abominable, since they both multiply the numbers of men. So keep that in mind. And as we look at the mirrors that I'm about to show you, I would like you not to just think of them as canvases for some sort of representation, but as working objects that were held and manipulated by living people, that reflected, projected, and distorted the images of those people, and that because of these unique qualities might have acquired a special function in the tomb and the afterlife of its owners. I start with this example, which was cast in one piece with its handle and has an engraving on its back. To give you an idea of the scale, these are about 5 to 6 inches in diameter, or 13 to 15 centimeters. So somewhere in between this mirror and this bowl. So this is the size that we're working with. And as far as we can tell, the engraved back depicts 2 young men facing one another and dressed in short tunics and floppy hats. And then there's a star rosette suspended in the field between them. And I say as far as we can tell because I think that this is something that you can do as well as I can, and without knowing for certain the identity of the figures. Hopefully you can appreciate the symmetry of the design. 2 figures facing each other, dressed similarly, mirroring their postures, and separated by an also symmetrical element. The design itself replicates the function of the object by turning one image into 2. Now, these are most likely the Tinas Clinar, who some of you might recognize from Greco-Roman mythology as the Dioscuri, a set of divine twins that were hatched from an egg. Their mother, a mortal woman, conceived them with 2 different men, as one does, and this is called heteropaternal superfecundation, by the way. And one father was mortal, like her, and the other was the god Zeus, who seduced her in the form of a swan, as he did. Of the twins, 2, one was mortal and the other divine, although eventually Zeus allowed them to share immortality so that they could remain together. The twins were the most common characters represented on Etruscan mirrors between the 4th and the 2nd centuries BC. And here we have another example from our collections. This is a Tang mirror, so it has an extension here for the insertion into a separate handle, likely made out of wood or bone. In this case, the reverse is decorated with a well-preserved, incised depiction of the twins, standing with a swan in the middle that represents their father, Zeus, and framed by a laurel wreath. They are not exact mirror images of each other, perhaps hinting at their dual nature, but we still get a sense of balance and symmetry from the composition. It is not hard to imagine why these characters were so popular. The fact that they are twins makes them appropriate for mirrors, as someone who looks at their own reflection can imagine that they see a twin. I definitely did when I was little. The twins were also said to be very beautiful. They were the brothers of Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, and thus appropriate inspiration during grooming. The egg from which they hatch could be associated with fertility, something that gets advertised through youth and beauty, so you need your mirror to help with that. And finally, they could illustrate movement into the afterlife, both in the sense of their transition from mortal to immortal, but also in the sense of physical movement. So the star here that's in the center is sometimes interpreted as a gateway to the underworld, and the twins then the guardians of that gate. So reflection, beauty, rebirth, immortality, themes that concern both the living and the dead. And the living here are very important, since if we consider the care and effort that went into ensuring the reflective quality of these mirrors, and also the evidence of ancient repairs. And here a quantity of bronze was poured over the tang to mend a break. And the repair is not beautiful, but it's like very sturdy. So then we cannot say that the spears were made specifically for the grave. And if they were not made solely for the grave, then that means that they were probably had to change somehow before functioning properly in that space. And to explore this further, I want to look at this mirror, the one that is actually on display in our gallery. And the mirror was cast in a single piece and has incised decoration on its back. In this case, we have three figures standing before an Ionic building. The central figure, who wears a helmet, is probably the Etruscan counterpart of the goddess Athena, but the other figures, one male and one female, are more difficult to identify. We like to say that this represents the judgment of Paris, but that scene requires three goddesses, and we only have two. So we don't really know what's going on here. Hopefully by now, you don't really care, since what you should have noticed is that this mirror was brutally perforated with 9 holes. And this was done before burial, by the way. So what is happening here? We refer to this practice as a ritual cancellation, though I like to call it a ritual murder. And this is not the only example, nor the only way to ritually cancel a mirror. Some examples were folded over so that the reflected side was no longer visible, and yet others were inscribed with the word Suthena for the tomb on the reflected side. So that also would make them a little bit useless. So was this to prevent the living from stealing the mirror by making them useless, or were the effects intended for the dead? It's hard to say. Etruscan scholar Nancy de Grumman has speculated that mirrors could be imprinted with the image and memory of the deceased. This is suggested by the fact that the Etruscan word for soul, hinthiel, also seems to have meant reflection or mirror image. Mirrors then could produce dual images. First, the mortal image of the person while they were alive, and then the eternal one. And their reflective sides could then be associated with the immortality of their owners. Were mirrors then permeable barriers that one could cross, or that one might need to protect somehow? It's an interesting and difficult question. And I kind of want to end with a somewhat perplexing example from our collection, which has also endured an interesting afterlife. And as far as we can tell, the mirror itself is ancient, but the engraving upon it is not. Technically, the suspect engraving is unlike any of the others we already saw. The engraving tool seems to have been rocked side to side, leaving a zigzag pattern, like you see it here, rather than the smooth lines that we get on the authentic mirrors. But the theme represented is odd as well. A female bust and a recumbent male, framed by inscribed retrograde letters that I have written for you here, but I'm not even going to attempt to read. I'll say the important part is this part here. It says Etruscus, and that's a strong indication that the inscription is a forgery, since the Etruscan word for Etruscans was Rasna or Rasenna. And I find this oddly compelling, since the word, like the forgery itself, is an incorrect distortion of the people that it aimed to imitate. And likewise, the choice of image, a portrait head, wrongly prioritizes the back of the mirror as the repository for the owner's symbolic identity. But as we have learned from the way in which they were placed in tombs with their reflective sides visible and their decorated ones obscured, and the way that their reflective sides were abused or transformed, it was the reflective side that could provide a meaningful connection between those who had died and those who wished to remember them. These mirrors, therefore, must not be seen as mere tomb furniture placed in the grave to prove someone's social status, but as highly symbolic objects, important to their owners both during their lifetimes and after their death, capable of reflecting elements of a consistent belief system, even if those beliefs are largely now lost to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Frances. That was incredible. And I feel like what we've heard has opened up so many questions that, of course, I would love to sort of press you on. This idea of the cancellation, or what you call the murder of the mirror. You mentioned that some of the mirrors were found placed down in the graves, which then meant they didn't need to be murdered in the same way. When you're doing that kind of work, I mean, you mentioned that the excavations were not as well documented as one would hope. How do you actually know now? Do we know which ones were sort of found placed down and therefore wouldn't have had to have these kind of puncturing wounds in them?
So it depends. So for some mirrors, we have really, really good context. And, in this cases, the bodies were laid out and surrounded by objects. So we know exactly how they were placed and where they were placed. And interestingly enough, a lot of the mirrors that we have records for were placed near the legs or in between the legs, so far away from the head. And I don't know that the ones that were canceled were those as well. But so I think placing them farther away kind of probably helped too, but always again with the reflective side up. There's one mirror that was found that was placed near the face, and it was of a woman, but it was placed so that she would always be looking, well, she was dead, but always be facing the back of the mirror, so not the reflective side. So the reflective side would be placed further away. So yeah, I think there's an interesting notion there that the reflective side could function as a sort of like permeable barrier, and that you either want that barrier to be available or not, depending, and that's the hard part to decipher, whether you want to have that connection or whether you're afraid that if you leave it open, then the soul of your loved one might get trapped in there or might come out. So it's hard to say because again, they're folding them, they're puncturing them, they're writing on them, but then they're also leaving that part exposed. So we don't really know.
It's fantastic in the way that it relates to your work on figurines, because anyone who's seen Frances's other incredible presentations on the collections knows that so much of what you're interested in is, as you said, the idea of it as an object and not just solely as doing the kind of symbolic work that it's doing. And it was really interesting to hear how it can make the transition from use to the grave.
Thank you. And now that you mentioned figurines also are many times found as gifts in graves. And often too, they are manipulated. So you do find figurines that are broken before they are deposited. But the mirror is interesting in that I really do think that they have this extra level of access to the afterlife that perhaps a figurine or a pot or a necklace won't have.
So while we have in the chat tons of praise for you, Frances, enthusiastic responses, still no additional questions as of yet. Oh, here comes one. Would the reflections be silver on that side, like silver leaf? And would that have been valuable to thieves or grave robbers?
Oh, that's a wonderful question. So no, these mirrors were made out of bronze, and the way that you make them reflective is just by burnishing and polishing that one surface a lot. So that's how you get the reflection. We do think that there were some mirrors that were made out of silver or of electrum, but those would have been rare, and probably people kept them and not left them in the tomb. I think there's one, we have one that has a little bit of silver within the engraving, so you can make it a little bit nicer. But yeah, something that would have been made of a nice material would have been definitely a target for a robber. I don't think just, destroying it would have prevented that, because then you can also just take the metal and melt it down and use it for something else. But the idea of making things useless for the grave extends to other objects as well. Sometimes vessels have a lip that you can't really drink from, makes them uncomfortable. So I don't know. I think you can always steal things, even if they're useless, and sell them or break them and reuse the materials. So theft is always a concern.
We have another great question. You had mentioned in the wonderful way you pointed out how also from our perspective today, often we gender the idea of the mirror. And you were very explicit about saying that the mirrors have not been found with children. Do you have a sense of why that would be, if it's not actually about adornment or grooming?
Yeah, no idea. There might be one mirror that's associated with one child, but that connection is not sure that I know. And then the rest of them are associated with adults. People still keep talking to them about being mostly with women, but I feel like the difference is not that much. Like maybe 20% of females have a mirror, and maybe 11% of burials that have men have one. So I still think it's balanced. And everyone needs to look good, right? I can't imagine men walking around life not looking at themselves in mirrors. But maybe there's an idea that children don't need to, children are beautiful and perfect as they are. And it's not until you're starting to become an adult and as a woman trying to become a wife that the adornment of the body really, takes precedence. You are trained as a young child to look up to that. So many of the dolls do already have hairdos and bodies that are adult, but you might, not be asked to emulate it in the same sense. So maybe that's why, or maybe, this kind of weird passage from one plane to the other was solely the realm of adults and not of children. Again, unsure. We don't have their writing, so we can't tell.
We have another question. Were mirrors the most common metal object in tombs? What about pots?
Oh, excellent question. Yeah. No, pots, they had tons of pots, but they also were, I love the Etruscans because they did terracotta really well. So they had really, really, really nice pottery that actually looked like metal, and very nice sculpture that was made out of clay. But there were tons of other metal objects. They were actually really good at most things. They were really good at jewelry, very good bronzesmiths, and very good clay sculptors. But yeah, mostly I would say the tombs had all sorts of dining implements, so pots, pans, plates, glasses. And then if you were really rich, you took your jewelry with you as well, and other implements for the house. Anything that you needed, a chair, a pillow, rope.
That was one of our questions, actually, about the differentiation between the wealthy and other folks. So were mirrors more common with the wealthy than with other people?
So we have found them both in modest and wealthier settings. It's hard to say, because the thing is, like, poor tombs don't survive. And also, we don't care that much about them. Or when we were doing archaeology early on, we went for the rich finds. So the rich people are disproportionately represented in history. And that's just a fact that we have to keep in mind all the time. So sometimes it's hard to say. Like, I don't want to say no, mirrors only belong to rich women, because it just so happens that we mostly just know about rich women. So I think that's hard to say.
One more question. I think we have time for one more. There was a question about mirrors. Were they used for divination as in other cultures?
Ooh, excellent question. I don't know for the Etruscans. The Etruscans had all sorts of like really intricate divination Rituals, they looked into the livers of animals, so that was very important. So we do have these models where we have livers drawn out and each part explained. They also looked at the flight patterns of birds, and that was very, very important. But I don't know about mirrors. Good questions. I will need to check that. Sorry.
Well, it is 2:30, so I have the tough job of ending our incredible session with Frances here. And I should say that after you leave this session, you're going to receive a short online survey, which I hope you will take a moment to complete. And that is going to be very helpful to us to have your feedback as we continue to develop and adjust our programming. I want to also invite you to come back on July 30th for our next Art Talk Live with Gabriela Saleh, our Rankaby and Pamela M. Tia Curatorial Fellow in the Bush Reisinger Museum, who is going to be speaking on the topic of 15th and 16th century carved wooden altarpieces. So please come back and join us, and visit also our website and the online calendar for more information about it and upcoming programs. So thank you very much, Frances. This was incredible as always. And I know from all of our participants who wrote in the chat how thrilled they were to have this opportunity to hear from you again. So thank you very much.